Hey everybody, welcome back to another case study. And today we're going to be doing a case study that we can really start to focus on certain elements of the US experience with terror. And there's so many incidents and things I want to talk about. It was difficult to make a choice, but I thought I would focus on one of the consequences of 9/11 and really want to do an exploration to some extent of the Patriot Act. We've People hear a lot about it, read a lot about it in the news, but I thought it'd be good to try to have a good condensed discussion regarding its elements, why it was passed, and how we need to think about it going forward. So, why did the Patriot Act get passed? Well, the argument is, one of the main arguments is that really after 9/11, especially in the immediate aftermath, we're talking days and hours after it happened, there were significant fears of additional attacks occurring. And the government at this point is really scrambling and looking for a way to try to protect citizens. At this point, the argument is the government doesn't want to see another incident like 9/11 occur, and so they're going to try to prevent this from happening. There are some people who have argued that the groundwork for the Patriot Act existed prior to 9/11, but we're going to focus on the fact that really it seems to emerge and became a necessary, some would argue a necessary power expansion to try to prevent another terrorist attack from occurring. But the consequences and whether we think this was justified and worthwhile in the long run is something we really have to think about and consider. So, the Patriot Act. We call it the Patriot Act, but the real name for the bill, also it's called the USA Patriot Act, is the Uniting and Strengthening America by Providing Appropriate Tools Required to Intercept and Obstruct Terrorism Act. And when you look at the acronym of that, that's the USA Patriot Act. That's how it gets its name. And the Patriot Act was passed 45 days after 9/11. So an extremely rushed process to try to what the government argued quickly give the necessary tools to try to prevent another terrorist attack. As you can see by the votes in the House and the Senate, these were largely passed based on bipartisan lines. George Bush is the president at the time, but we can see by the numbers, individuals from both parties are supporting the Patriot Act. And interestingly enough, it's the Patriot Act when it was passed was set to expire by 2005. And every time it's been passed, it has included what they call sunset provisions that at some point it has to be renewed before a certain date. And this has actually been the case that it's been renewed 3 times until it was finally allowed to quote unquote expire, but was essentially replaced by what's called the USA Freedom Act, which has many of the same provisions as the Patriot Act, but just has a different name. So it continues to be an issue today, and the legacy of the Patriot Act is still something that we are dealing with today. So, what are some of the major elements? What did it do? Why did the government think it was important? So, I'd say, there are lots of elements to it, but the four I really want to focus on here are national security letters, sneak and peek, wiretaps, and data collection. And the final one, data collection, probably being one of the most significant. So, the first element, national security letters, these are letters or essentially what law enforcement agents draft to try to get access to certain records, things like credit card, financial records, and are able to do so with the approval of a federal judge, but not necessarily requiring the burden of proof and standards you need to actually acquire a warrant. So it essentially gave the government greater power, greater authority to try and look at individuals' private records in pursuit of capturing and hunting down terrorists. And the next one is this idea of sneak and peek. And this was the idea that the government would have the capacity to investigate individuals, carry out warrants without providing them notification that they were being searched. So the government could come into an individual's home, they would be able to look around and they would be able to leave without leaving any trace or notification that they were investigating a particular individual. And this was seen and argued was necessary to try to combat terrorists who may be planning to carry out an attack, because if they're made aware, this may make it more difficult for the government to actually catch them. The next was the expansion and usage of wiretaps and surveillance. We talked about the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. There really was an increasing in the capacity of the federal government to get access to and tap phones, especially for foreign nationals. This was a major focus of the government. So there's an increase in expansion of that. And then also, not only did they make it easier to carry out a wiretap, wiretaps now no longer, in the past they had previously applied when a law enforcement agency applied for a warrant to issue a wiretap, they could apply to a particular phone or phone number. But now this was changed so that wiretaps applied to people, so they could search other devices, their computers, things like this. It was no longer just one particular phone number. It applied to a person. And then finally, probably the most significant element, and we're going to talk about some here when we look at Edward Snowden here in just a minute, is the issue of data collection and the significant expansion in terms of the government's capacity to collect data on individuals' phone calls, internet history, text messages. All of these things became much easier for the government to have access to and collect. So, how do we know really the extent of the capacity of the federal government to engage in data collection? Well, largely we're responsible based on the Edward Snowden leaks and subsequent leaks that have come since then that have really exposed the extent of data collection. So the government was running a number of programs. One that they were running was called PRISM, and this provided the government, through its agreements and communication with Google and Yahoo, access to individuals' Google searches, search history, emails. All these things were being accessed by the government when they wanted to. We also had the National Security Agency, the NSA, was collecting millions of emails and texts as well as storing phone calls. So they were storing this information, collecting this information on millions and millions of people, and really raising the question of, are they focusing on terrorists, or are they just casting a broad net and collecting all the information that they have? And it's actually estimated that 90% of information that has been collected on individuals who are not considered targets. So this really brings up questions about who the government's collecting information on, and should they have the right to collect extensive amounts of data, even sometimes if it's just what we call metadata on individuals. They also use their capacity to collect and search individuals' internet cookies. They were spying on users who had Xbox Live, World of Warcraft, and they even expanded their spying capacities not just on individuals domestically, but also abroad. It's estimated they've been spying on up to 122 world leaders. At one point, it came out that the CIA had actually managed to crack the Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel's cell phone. We're able to listen to her conversation. So we really see the mass expansion of U.S. capacity for collection of data based on the Patriot Act. So this is trying to give you a visualization of some of the elements and some of the areas they're able to collect information. The federal government was collecting information from all of these companies that almost everybody has plugged into in some way or another, looking at AT&T, Verizon, Sprint, Facebook, Apple, Google, Microsoft, Yahoo, AOL. So we see here just their access and capacity to gain information from some of the largest U.S. companies that most people have some sort of connection to, whether it's usage of Facebook, usage of a cell phone provider, usage of the most popular and most dominant search engines. So it's really having an effect in touching most people's lives in some way or another, without most people having a realization of what the government was actually doing. And this really leads to a lot of the questions that have come up with the Patriot Act and the collection of information, and this back and forth we have between the issue of civil liberties or privacy versus security. And really, it's a difficult question to ask um, whether the U.S. government should be carrying out these actions. Do we have a right to privacy? Do we have a right to protect our information, to have privacy? Do these companies have the right to give the government our information without our permission? And so, really want to leave it off here with our final discussion question for the day, and that is: should the U.S. prioritize security over civil liberties? Why or why not? Should the U.S. prioritize security over civil liberties? Why or why not? I think this is a good way to really think about and try to get an understanding of whether we think the Patriot Act is worth it or not. All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.